Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. Being December, we're back again with our regular guest, Kvelduflr Gundarsson, and he's going to talk about Yule. Now, I went back and looked, and I noticed last year we did a lot of Yule spooky stuff. But I think there's a lot more to Yule than just the spooky stuff. We can touch on that, too. But I just thought I'd give you that as sort of an introduction to remind you that, you know, what we did last year and what you may want to look at this year.
Okay, well, it's kind of hard to talk about Yule without talking about spooky stuff and the other spooky holy days. But one thing I've seen a lot of lately on the webs and places where people go to ask questions is something rather more cheerful and home-like, which is the question of traditional heathen Yule decorations and the like. And there have been a number of people who have been asking me questions like, you know, what did people do back in the day? What are good things to do now? How do I find suitable decorations for my home at this time of year? So I had been thinking I would talk about that.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, now, we don't really know what the Vikings did as far as home decoration in Yule time, or the early Saxons, or the early Germans, or whoever. But we can make some reasonable guesses based on bits and pieces recording here and there, and also on the most persistent and enduring folk customs. One of the things that seems to be fairly consistent everywhere as far as we can tell is the practice of bringing in greenery, of decorating the house with greenery in some form. And of course this is done throughout Northern Europe and probably in several other places, but certainly in Northern Europe. In various ways. Of course, we always think of Yule as evergreens because, well, that's what's green at the time. And there are several other reasons why one might, from a traditional viewpoint, want to bring evergreens into one's house at what is indeed the spookiest time of year. Some of them, juniper, for instance, has long been known and is still known in Scandinavia as a protective tree, a tree that you use. You can put sprigs in the wash water when washing your floor to clear your house of any untoward influences that are on it. It was also common in Norway to use it as a sort of smudge or incense to clear out the house, which was undoubtedly both spiritual and highly practical. Juniper is very aromatic, and if you're living in traditional circumstances with a lot of people who may not get out to the sauna more than once a week and are working hard, and it's not that big of a house with not that great of a ventilation, a bit of juniper lightening the air was probably real welcome, and drove away untoward influences on all levels, including the medical. It's, you know, it's not exactly chlorine bleach, but it does have a certain amount of antiseptic properties, and was probably a very healthy thing to add to the wash water or the general environment. Then you have the pointy plants, such as pine and holly, which are notable because they have little pointy things on them, and putting things with points like pine branches or needles or small knives or whatever around your house and your bed at night, if there was somebody or something in particular after you, is a very well-known traditional Scandinavian way of discouraging unwanted non-physical nighttime visitors. Possibly physical ones as well, if you actually followed some of the traditions and left the pointy things with the points up around your bed, but that's a different issue altogether. And holly, of course, has those red berries which tend fairly universally to be associated with spiritual protection. I can't think of any specific focuses on holly aside from the fact that it has the thorny leaves. but it does seem to fit into the general category of powerful plants with red berries. Our ancestors brought greenery into the house or hall. Now, in the West, in this day and age, of course, everyone thinks about the Yule tree. That seems to have been pretty much a German thing. In fact, that was almost exclusively a German thing, except for America, which got it from the very large German immigrant population. And in England, they didn't start using trees until Victoria's Prince Albert got homesick for his trees back at home in Germany at that time of year. And of course, once the Queen was doing it, everyone did it. Similarly, I have met people in Denmark who remembered not having, old people who remembered not having Christmas trees as small children because, well, it really hadn't caught on in Scandinavia, even early in the 20th century. Now, of course, everyone has their tree. But it's a very, very modern thing. And what was done before that in England, the tradition was to put up the Yule bough. You would take a large branch, if I recall correctly, yew was the preferred wood, and you would affix it over your mantelpiece. Don't put it over the heater in your house if you don't have good ventilation. It is slightly toxic and it can release fumes, okay? It's fine to do it with pine, although it will dry out and be a bit of a fire hazard. But if you are using actual yew wood, be careful with it. Anyway, they would put this huge bough of yew up over the mantelpiece. They would hang stuff off it. And that was the English version. In Scandinavia, the tradition was to make wreaths out of pine branches. And you to this day, you see these beautiful wrought iron wreath frameworks that you would weave your pine branches through and put candles in. My own grandmother always insisted on having the wreaths up as well as the tree. So all of those are very good things to do, and there's nothing wrong with the tree. They've been doing it in Germany for centuries and possibly as far as we know, millennia. Now, the tree was a centerpiece of festivities in Scandinavia, but it was usually a tree growing outside, and it wasn't necessarily an evergreen. It was the tradition for a household, a farmstead, to have a tree which was in a central position, and there were a number of different names to it, but they all pretty much boiled down to the tree of the steading, the tree of the garth. And people would go out and, yes, hang offerings on it, put food down by the roots. Generally, of course, they wouldn't have called it that after the conversion, but essentially they were still worshiping at these trees, again, right up into the 20th century. And for all I know, some people still are out there on their farms in Denmark or Sweden or Norway keeping the tradition. I certainly hope so. I don't know why they started bringing the whole tree in Germany. I've heard it suggested that it was a way to hide your tree worship from your Christian neighbors, whatever. As far as I know, there's no evidence and not a lot of recorded comment on the subject, so it's kind of a roll your own. Now, in modern heathenry, of course, the tree is a custom which has been joyfully kept up, indeed swooped up, and again, this is a totally modern thing, but an awful lot of people see the Yule tree as being, for the time of the Yule nights, the physical embodiment of the world tree in their home. I've often seen various people decorate it with, a snake or more likely a stuffed snake or such at the bottom, and then an eagle on the top where Christians put stars or angels or whatever, Christians put on their trees, and all sorts of offering-like decorations hung between. So some people get really elaborate and try to go with the 9 worlds and such. But the idea of your own Yule tree, your own world tree over the Yule nights is a pretty good idea. It emphasizes, I think, that sense that this really is a holy time period, a border time period, when the ways between the worlds are open, when the roads up and down the world tree, if you like, are all open for communication, and having that central focal point right there in your drawing room, that's kind of a nice thing to do. Again, the decorations, it's long been said by pretty much everyone that the practice of decorating the tree goes back to when we hung offerings on the tree, and admittedly, a lot of the offerings that we hung on trees back when you wouldn't necessarily want in your heated living room for hanging there for 12 days. They would tend to get a bit off. It was better made in the open, I think. But at any rate, there's, again, no proof of this. It's sort of folk practice, evolution of things that people wouldn't have talked about even if it had been the case. But it seems perfectly reasonable, and we do know that it was also a pretty common practice, again, as mostly known by common folklore. We don't get a lot of references to it in the Old Norse sources, but making offerings to various spirits and the like by hanging stuff on trees. Up north, in northern Norway, in Hålogaland, for instance, it was the practice to make little paper boats or wood or straw boats or whatever, and put food, fat, bread, whatever in them, and hang them on trees in the wood for, quote, the Yule folk, unquote. This did not come with a definition of the Yule folk, wights, ghosts, the gods. We don't know, but the principle seems pretty sound. And there are some types of decoration which have been very, very traditional for a very long time, is all we can say. The Scandinavian ones are the ones I know best, and the ones I find particularly interesting because there's two designs that are really dominant. One of which is the pig, and it's been common for who knows how long, probably since the conversion, would be my guess, to make breads in the shapes of pigs, to put out on the Yule table, and to make little bread or cookie dough or whatever pigs, and hang them up as decorations. And now, of course, they've become tree ornaments. In fact, Kosta Boda, the Swedish crystal company, does a lovely little lead crystal pig for this purpose. And of course, the pig being associated with Yule is something that we can certainly say is very, very, very Norse indeed. Herbrur saga Akedrex describes specifically the boar being brought around for the oath swearing at Yule night. And the boar, of course, is very, very strongly associated with both Freyr and Freya. Could probably talk for hours about the symbolism of the boar. In fact, I know a guy, Professor Heinrich Beck, who wrote a book on it, Das Ebersignum im Germanischen, or something to that effect. But the other animal that plays a huge part in inspiring Scandinavian Yule decoration is the goat. And those of you who come from Scandinavian families will probably be very familiar with the Yule buck, which is traditionally this straw. It's a straw goat. You take a load of straw and you kind of get it wet and malleable. Bend it in various ways, plait it, tie it with ribbons, and at the end of it you have a beautiful straw goat with plaited horns and tail. And these come in various sizes, from real small to absolutely freaking humongous.
Yes, I believe there's one in Norway making the rounds of the internet right now that's about the size of a 3-story building or something. I can't tell because there wasn't anything in perspective, but it was just a very large Yule buck.
Yeah, so what do we make of the Yule buck, you may well ask. Well, most people, of course, you hear goat, you immediately think Thor. You think of Thor and his goats, and it's entirely possible that the straw Yule buck did start out as a way of honoring Thor without, getting into trouble back in the day. And it may have indeed been much older than that, from times when one didn't have to worry about one's neighbors seeing one honoring Thor because they were out there doing the same and would have probably looked funny at you if you didn't, especially if you were out worshipping Odin instead, and even more if you lived in Iceland, but different issue. Okay, so back to our straw Yule bucks, which may or may not go back to the Heathen era, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did. We think of Thor, but there's a lot more to the goat than most people are aware of. And the thing that most people don't think about goats in regards, at least if they're not living in northern Norway or have never kept goats themselves, is that goats to the Norse mind are really kind of creepy creatures. Actually, they're incredibly creepy creatures. They are the sort of livestock you'd expect to find in the bad neighborhoods of Ettenholm. They are the sort of livestock that you expect to find running around at night doing gods know what. Actually, the gods do know perfectly well what, as do the Ettins, as we see in Hyndlulioth, where Hyndla says to Freya something about Freya cavorting about like Heathen the nanny goat at night. And I think we can safely assume that she was not saying that Freya was eating the god's garden. I think that was not what was implied by the statement. It was in fact, a very poetic way to say, Freya, you a big ol' hole.
Well, actually, aren't goats one of the only barnyard creatures that don't really have a season per se? They can just sort of do it whenever.
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure of that.
It seems logical. It's and it would certainly go with Hyndla's remark.
Yeah, that was my first thought, because I think I'd have to look it up, but I think I've read other places that they're at least billy goats. I'm not sure about nannies, but I think
billies are always on season. I think nannies are seasonal. Yeah, goats have this distinctly wild sexual character, and that is probably part of what we're also seeing in the story of how Loki made Skadi laugh. The whole episode actually is very characteristic of goats. We have Loki, who is a bit of a marginal character himself in many ways. Certainly, wide range of sexual activity. Often unpredictable, very valuable, and many people depended on their goats for, food, trade goods, survival, but also, someone tricky, someone you want to keep an eye on, just like you've got to keep an eye on your goat if you want to have a garden. Better yet, if you want to have a garden, let your neighbor keep the goats.
Yeah.
And Here we have Loki, this very marginal person who is needed literally almost to break the ice. There needs to be this streak of wildness, and you notice the way he does it, which is, it's very, very, very sexual. He ties the goat to his testicles and demonstrates a tug of war with his privates. Which Skadi, demonstrating the robust humor so characteristic of the Germanic peoples, finds absolutely freaking hilarious. Again, here we are out just at the borders of Ettenland, and the main player is the goat. In later folklore, we see goats again associated with trolls as forms that trolls take. Gallahoo's horns, there's an image of a three-headed giant who I believe is holding a goat on a lead. So there's this constant association, which makes us look just a little more carefully at our cute little straw Yule bucks. Because the other thing about the Yule buck in Scandinavia, and this is an aspect that's not seen as much in the most modern times, it's not terribly commercial, is that the Yule buck wasn't just a form of decoration. The Yule buck was a being, a otherworldly being. Mostly in the celebrations, particularly in Denmark, you would see it being used as a masker's disguise in the same way as that weird skull-headed white horsey thing they have in Wales. People would put on the goat mask and the big shaggy cloak, and go around to houses terrorizing people and collecting drink and food and such. And it was one of those things, as many of these supernatural things in Yule are, you're real nice to them when they're there, and if everything goes well, it's a blessing on your house, and when they leave without anything going catastrophically wrong and disastrous, you heave a great sigh of relief. So the Yule buck was a frightening figure in the folklore again. In Sweden, the Yule buck was said to live in a how, in a burial mound. Sometimes appeared as a skinless goat, and often enough its appearance actually brought sickness and pestilence, kind of a peculiar opposite to the Danish version, where it's mostly a benevolent figure as long as everything's done properly. Now, when things weren't done properly, when the Yule buck was offended, things went very badly, and there's a Danish story. One of the many ways the Yule buck was done was a goat's head on a stick, again, to be carried about, and this was kept out in the barn. People presumably were a bit leery about having it in the house at night. And there was a young serving girl, a common source of folklore stories, who was like, yeah, I dance with the Yule buck at midnight. I'm not afraid of anything. And she goes out at midnight and to dance with the Yule buck to show she's not afraid of anything. It's just a stuffed goat head on a stick. I mean, what's the big deal? What are you folk getting all upset about? Okay, so she goes out at midnight to the barn where the Yule buck is leaning against the wall. And a little while later, the people in the house hear this God's awful thumping and screaming and spattering and horrible noises. And when they go out in the morning, when it's safe, they find that, in fact, she has danced with the Yule buck, and it took umbrage and battered her to death against the walls of the barn, which thereafter was hideously haunted and all of the usual stuff. It's a bit like the Tomte, who is also very much present at Yule. And if you're in Scandinavia, you will see little Tomte figures and Tomte drawings and paintings and placemats, coasters, what have you, all over the place. And of course, Tomte is somebody that is very important to have around. He is, best guess is that he was probably the first settler buried on the land who stuck to look after his farm and family, and brings the family luck, and doesn't ask for much. All he wants is his porridge with his butter every Thursday, and a pouch of tobacco at New Year's, maybe the odd glass of schnapps as things go along. But if you offend the Tomte, he will do something awful, like shove you in an oven and burn you to death, as happened to one apprentice in a foundry who felt that messing with his porridge would be funny. The Tomte did not share that opinion. But when well treated, and you'd have to be an idiot not to, the Tomte is a wonderful friend, a good family member, and it's really difficult to imagine a Scandinavian Yule without him.
These are the little figures that you sometimes see like on the net right now they look kind of like elves or dwarves but with a little bit of edge to them, and they're often feeding long-haired cats or...
Yeah, they've got you. Traditionally, he wears either a pointy red hat or a pointy gray hat, and yes, it's reasonably likely that some of the depictions of commercial Santa Claus were influenced by Scandinavians, were influenced by the Tomte imagery. If you saw a picture, if you without knowing what it was, if you looked at a Swedish picture of the Tomte doing his farmyard stuff at Yule, you would think, "Whoa, Santa's got an evil brother." He's not actually evil, but he's got that sharp, don't mess with me look about him, kind of a craggy look.
He almost always has a bowl of porridge.
Yeah. Yes, and the porridge is really crucial, and with lots of butter, and the butter on top of the porridge, because if you hide it under the porridge, Tomte may think that someone nicked it or forgot it, and then he'll be very sorry afterwards when he realizes that the butter was in there all along, but the person who thought that this would be a funny joke hiding it is not in such good condition. There's an awful lot of Tomte stories along these lines.
I'm sure. You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future. So what other forms of decoration can you...
What other forms of decoration do people use or have people use? Well, in modern Ausatru, I think various forms of holy animals as per the deity or deities of your choice are very popular.
What about the horses?
Yeah, horses are a very important part of the Yule thing. Surprisingly, you don't see them as indoors decoration nearly as much, unless you live in Sweden, in which case you have those Dala horses everywhere, those particular type of Swedish wooden horse, but they're not really specifically a Yule thing so much as, well, actually what they are now is mostly a tourist semi-cultured Scandinavian thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in the actual celebration of Yule, or more accurately, the celebrations surrounding this period of time at Yule, horses were terrifically significant. And this brings us back to the Wild Hunt, or rather the Furious Host, which in Scandinavia changed names, became St. Stephen's Ride, did not apparently change anything else in any way about it. And St. Stephen is known in Northern Europe as the patron and healer of horses, which makes no sense whatsoever from the Christian context of St. Stephen, but makes a very great deal of sense when you look at some of, for instance, the Stephen's Ride ballads that talk about him riding on the north wind on his dapple gray horse.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, some very straightforward and not particularly carefully camouflaged substitution going on there.
Isn't gray animals sort of spooky or?
Yeah, gray animals are by definition spooky. They're usually undead, not always. But whenever an animal shows up in the sagas and is described as gray, you know there is something otherworldly about it. And that's all the way from Jörmungandr becoming a big gray cat as described in the Prose Edda, to Droigar, Sleipnir. In later folklore, the plague takes the form of a gray horse with an irregular number of legs.
Yeah, I noticed a few years ago, actually, I'd never heard of that before, but in Iceland, there's sort of a revival of the gray Christmas cat or something.
Yeah, and it's gray because it's otherworldly and likely to eat people.
So now, it's the Yule cat.
Yeah, the Icelandic Yule cat is an interesting development. I'm not sure how old it is, and some of the Icelandic Yule stuff is very old. There is, for instance, this troll Grilla who lives up in the hills, and she's got 13 kids with real funny names. And at Yule, she comes down and catches kids and hauls them back to put in her stew pot or make sausage out of, or whatever she does. But we have, again, this mumming tradition with young men dressed up as these guys with the funny names and coming into the house, making noise, playing pranks, getting their drinking food, and going away. Again, a bit like the Danish Yule buck, in fact. But Grilla is described as having a multiplicity of tales. And in Sturlunga Saga, which was written in the 14th century, there is a bit of a poem with a reference to Grilla and her 13 tales, or whatever. I think it's 13 tales she has. But the description of Grilla in the poetry in the saga is pretty much identical to the description of Grilla you'll get if you go touristing in Reykjavik around Yule time here in 2014. So some of this is pretty old. The Yule cat, I don't know, but the idea is it's this huge gray cat, and if you don't get new clothes at Yule, the Yule cat will eat you.
Yeah, I can't tell either whether it's like really old, but I think it certainly reflects probably older customs or older ideas. Whether the cat itself was the original figure or not is hard to tell.
Yeah, I mean, it could be as recent as 18th, 19th century. It could be, who knows.
The cats are pretty spooky.
Yeah, cats are pretty spooky. Iceland is a place where they're closer to the spooky than most of us.
But if anybody, that would be kind of a fun tradition if you want to, particularly if you want to give your kids clothes at Yule and not have them totally complain. I mean, you want to give them toys too, but you can revive or borrow the Icelandic tradition of the Yule cat, who yes. I think it's you have to get a pair of socks every year or something.
Yeah, I think it might be socks. I think it's new clothes, and that's. Yeah, you must write your Aunt Nanny a letter thanking her for that ghastly sweater because she kept you from being eaten by the Yule cat this year.
That's a great idea. Well, that's some really interesting decorations. What are some ways of actually celebrating? For example, you mentioned the 12 days of Yule. I'd be curious of that.
Now that's a discussion that is never going to be really resolved because I'm not sure there is a resolution, and here we're dealing with a very wide area in both space and time where there was undoubtedly a lot of regional variations. As far as the dating of Yule, the academic consensus is that it was probably sometime between the beginning of December and mid to late January. Where in there depends on which academic you're talking to. Jan de Vries, who was one of the great Germanic scholars of the ages, was very strongly of the opinion that it was actually in January. It was going on somewhere between the 6th and the 17th or thereabouts, so somewhere in those first 2 to 3 weeks. And certainly in folk practice again, in Norway you have the custom of chasing out the trolls on Knut's Day, which I think is January 17th. and that's the end of the season in Norway. You open your doors and you bang on pots and pans and make a huge amount of noise to drive out any trolls that came to visit over Yule and now wish to overstay their welcome.
And if you have a cat named Troll, you carry her carefully outside, let her paws touch the ground, and then bring her back in.
Yeah, she was a purebred breeding queen, so she didn't get to stay out long.
No.
But we ritually carried her out the door and put her forepaws on the ground at every Knut stay.
Yes.
But at any rate, on the other hand, in Scandinavia in particular, we tend to get an early start on the festivities around Santa Lucia's Day. You have the various Lucia festivals, all of which involve a lot of greenery and candles, and traditional staying up late at night, and not a huge amount of Christian stuff.
I was going to ask you about Santa Lucia, if some of that, because it always seemed to be rather pagan. Yeah,
and the logic, but very, very much so, and for some reason, the main figure, the figure crowned with light is often described as the Christ child, but it's always a young girl that plays it. Always a girl, and it's one of those, I suppose, things where you have a lot of stuff amalgamated, and it would be difficult to try to pin down who was what or who was meant to be what. But it's certainly not a bad model for adding to Alcatraz celebrations. You might have Frigg with her lights bearing the coffee and schnapps and whatever blessings. Or Freya, or Heathen, or the goddess of your choice. But that's usually early in December, about the time most people, except for department stores, start to decorate. And as far as historical explanations of the timing of Yule, I think the best one we probably have is Bede, who indicates that the Anglo-Saxon Yule festivities started at or the night just before the winter solstice, with what he calls Mother Nights. And I think most of us today have taken it that, indeed you start off Yule honoring the Disir, honoring the goddesses. One gets the impression that the Anglo-Saxon Yule probably went on for more or less roughly from the solstice to roughly New Year's. And that's, I'd say overall, that's probably the most popular in modern Alcatraz. But, which night, if any of them, is the most important, that's variable. And not only is your guess as good as mine, but since it probably did vary hugely depending on your region and tribe and family traditions, your guess is probably better for you than my guess is.
Well, I would think that winter solstice probably played some role in it, because, they found that very, I forget what it's dated to, but that Germanic necklace, for example, or it's a pendant or something, it has the moon phases on it, that shows, astronomy going back quite a long, long way in terms of being able to determine when it was.
Yeah, I think everyone was certainly pretty clear on the solstice, and since the most of our traditions, in fact, pretty much all the Yule traditions, seem to revolve around it being the darkest and coldest time of the year, it makes sense that it should be in some way anchored to the solstice. It's just, how anchored is it? Again, Jan de Vries thought it was later. Some people think it's earlier. But I suppose the most common element, the most fundamental element, is that it wasn't like a 1 or 2 night thing. It was an ongoing season. We have traditionally, we have in the English-speaking culture, we're socked into the 12 days of Christmas, and that is possibly very old. In Germany, the term is Weihnachten. It's plural. It's holy nights. Which makes, of course, perfect sense, because this was a time when people got together, held family gatherings. If you were a king or a jarl or what have you, you'd be holding a big feast that a lot of people would be coming to. And this wasn't exactly like getting in your car and heading down the interstate for 500 miles in an afternoon. If you wanted to get to your relative's hall, you had to harness up the horses to the sleigh, make sure they had their the proper shoes on for going over ice and what have you, and then make a long and possibly fairly dangerous truck. And you weren't going to do that, say hi, have a few drinks, and turn around the next morning and go home. If you trucked over to someone's place for a feast back in the day, chances were you were going to want to stay a little while.
I think that really came home to me again, like a lot of things, when we moved here to Ireland, because I remember reading, doing a little research on our house and the area around it, and how there was a men's club in the 19th century that met on the night of the full moon, because that was when the carriages could get to Birr, which was our nearest town, which is, nowadays it's like 10 minutes drive.
Yeah.
But then it would have been, a couple of hours in your carriage. And I've looked out at nights on the full moon, and even in winter, you could see why.
Yeah, because we're way out in the country, and folk, it's dark out here at night.
And it would have been in Scandinavia.
It's really dark.
Yeah, that's when it really came out, how dark it would have been. And I just can't imagine, particularly because the Yule would have been one of those festivals when probably the phase of the moon was less important than the solstice. It's something we don't really know.
Yeah, there are, as far as I know, no indications for a Yule component for a lunar component in Yule. Now winter nights, there's various indications that was a full moon festival, which actually makes a lot of sense. It was the massive slaughter festival, and if you had a lot of critters to get through at that time of year when it was growing dark faster, being able to do some of the work by moonlight was probably real helpful.
That would be the slaughtering festival, like either September or October, depending on where you were.
October or November, depending on where you were. October in continental Scandinavia, November in England.
Okay.
But that one probably was associated with the full moon. Yule really seems to have been timed in some way based on the solstice.
So we have Santa Lucia and we have Mother Nights. What else do we have?
Yeah, in terms of the actual worship that our ancestors were doing at Yule, there's the question, what were they doing? Well, we know that it was a time to have feasts, big feasts if you were a jarl, king, big landowner, small family feasts, if you were, just your average farmer or craftsperson or what have you. And some of the things that were done at the feast, first off, one of the understandings of Yule, and this goes back to it being kind of a borderline time, a time when the ways between the world were open, is that it's probably the most powerful time for making vows, doing rituals, doing anything that one wants to set well and firmly and weird. And of course, one should think very hard before doing anything like that, because we have a number of sagas and other sources suggesting that making vows when one has been enjoying the fellowship of the hall excessively, or possibly is just high on testosterone, is really not that good of an idea. But we have the bringing the boar around to swear on its back. We have the practice of making oaths at the drinking time at Sumbul. And again, just a few words here. What our ancestors thought of as symbol and what we call symbol now really don't resemble each other all that much. We now have the sort of very modern science fiction convention bardic circle, where, the same horn passes from mouth to mouth and everyone, makes a toast and either entertains everyone or possibly in an embarrassed way mutters "Hails Thor" and passes it on to the next person, before they can embarrass themselves further. But back in the day, it was probably much less formal. The leader of the hall would make the main toast, the main ritual hailings for everyone, and then people would sort of stand up in the course of the evening as the spirit or possibly the mead or ale moved them, and would say whatever they had to say. But Yule was certainly the most powerful time to be doing this.
Was there any tradition of gift giving that we know of? Or is that just sort of a modern thing? Or perhaps Roman?
It's not modern. At least it's certainly, well, you can't call anything modern that's been going on for over 1,000 years and really God's know how long.
That's true.
It's not terrifically historically documented. If you were trying to do an absolutely strict, nothing but what is definitively, positively proven reenactment, you might not include gift giving in it. My gut feeling, again, based on the complete ubiquity of the practice, and the degree to which it was completely ubiquitous, from so early on in Europe after the various stages of conversion, all of those lead me to think that it was probably something that was there in the culture, or at the very least fit with it. But it would also make a lot of sense, again, in the practical context, of, this is when you get together with your family or go to party at your king's or jarl's or whoever's hall or whatever. And at any, particularly at any big public celebration, and any time your king, jarl, queen, whatever leader you had was sitting, as it were, in court, you would expect to see them handing out prezzies with a pretty free hand under normal circumstances. You certainly would expect to see a lot of it at something as big as a Yule feast. And, if you're seeing your family for the first time in a little while, you've trucked through the snow and ice and 3 whole freaking hours of daylight in the middle of winter in Sweden or Norway or wherever you are, this is probably a time when if you've got any prezzies for anyone, you're going to want to be giving them.
But one thing I would think that people could do, because I'm thinking of like when we were, of course this is SCA stuff, but when we were Viking Prince and Princess, when we were stepping down, we gave out loaves of bread and some other things as gifts. If you're having a Yule at somebody's house, if the person who's hosting it wants to, it would be very much into spirit to give out like little tokens.
Absolutely.
Or something of either bread, cookies, or something that represents the season.
Yeah, it absolutely would. It would be very, very, very appropriate.
Yeah, and I think what we need to look at ways maybe because I seeing a lot of that on the web right now is people really searching for practical ways to try to keep the traditions that we have, that we've sort of borrowed back from, the Christians kind of took over, and then the heathens are sort of taking back, and some of which never left.
It's our culture.
Amalgamating them, but it's little things like that just make it a little bit special.
Yeah, and something else, that doesn't get talked about a lot now, is the place of doing crafts during the Yule nights. And this is really interesting. A lot of the folklore here comes from Germany now, 19th century Germany, because there seems to have been kind of a dual view of practicing any sort of crafts during the Yule nights. And it boils down to, first, stuff you make during those nights is special, if you're making something special. Secondly, if it's something you do mundanely every day because you have to do it, you don't do it at Yule. You lay it aside. And there are all these ghastly South German stories about girls who were lazy and had to finish their spinning during the Yule nights. And then Perchta came in and ripped their guts out and replaced them with straw and sticks, kind of thing. So, if you're out there, and you're a spinner, weaver, whatever, I either don't do it on Yule or set it aside for something that is truly, magical, religious, or otherwise a special project and not in any way related to your mundane activity. Bad things will happen.
I found that even before we met, though, I tended to do that. I tended to have Yule spinning and things to be special things, even if it was finishing something that was a gift. It was something that was not. And I think that's a good way of looking at it, because when I first started looking into this stuff, I was really kind of appalled because about all of the don't weave or spin over Yule, because for a lot of weavers and spinners in the modern world, that's the one time they get to do something.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very different situation. If back in the day when you were doing whatever it was you did in the governmental bureaucracy, if someone had said to you, Melody, you must not do any filing during these 12 nights, they are holy nights,
I would have been delighted.
Yeah, cries of joy, cries of relief, which is probably how most women felt back in the day about the spinning and weaving thing.
I'm reminded of the woman on the Texas frontier who, when the very first sold clothing store came into town that actually sold cloth, that took her loom and was said to have thrown it in the river and then burned it.
Yeah.
Burned parts of it and then thrown the ashes in the river. Because, and it's hard for me as a weaver to understand that, except, if I had to do it for all my family's clothes all the time, whether I wanted to or not, in the midst of everything else, the cooking and running a farm and having 6 kids or whatever, I could see how, when the cloth came in, you'd finally want to just burn the thing.
Yeah, I mean, think of all those women in this country who ecstatically chucked their knitting needles.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, we ran into that when we first moved here, actually. They were chucking the knitting needles and they were chucking the looms.
Yeah, we got here just at the point of transition. But so at the same time, you have this prohibition against doing mundane, everyday textile crafts. You also have things like if you wanted to weave a shirt to make someone proof against bullets or edged weapons or whatever it was, it had to be done by a maiden during the 12 nights of Yule.
So this is a really good time to knit your brother in the armed services a cap.
Yeah, this would be a splendid time to do textile arts, to protect your loved ones in the services.
Yeah.
This would be an ideal time, and pray Frigg's warding for them.
Exactly. The other thing that I thought of too, though, because I remember mentioned when this first came up, that we did no work during Yule, and I'm going, right, so who made the food, who made the beds, who catered for all the guests? And I think the difference, again, is that you're doing Yule cooking.
Yeah.
You would, because I think women probably had to do a lot of things during the Yule season.
Yeah, I mean, people must have done, you can't, not feed the pigs for 12 nights.
No, you can't. That's the other thing, if you've ever lived on a farm, you just can't not do the work.
But there was this sense that at least you tried to set the mundane work aside as much as you could, for this period of time. This really was, I won't say it was the only rest people got, because actually, once the crops are planted and before harvest, farmers actually do get, usually some downtime, and could, go off biking or whatever they were going to do, and then come home for the harvest. But then it was probably pretty psychotic work till Yule, with harvest and then slaughter and, getting the roof repaired before it got snowed in, and all the things that one has to do if one is living on a farm in a not so gentle climate in a pre-tech civilization.
Well, probably the best thing I think people might want to watch, because it's on a lot YouTube among other places, is the BBC production of The Year of the Tudor Farm, because at the very end of that they do the 12 Days of Christmas, and they not only do they have the Christmas bough being put on it, but I'm thinking of the housewife who is incredibly busy during this period. In fact, she's nearly working herself to exhaustion, but it's different stuff. It's Yule baking. It's Yule decoration. It's even Yule sewing. It's
Exactly.
everything. It's focused on the Yule season.
And particularly when you're thinking about your main celebration, one thing that means a lot to me is planning a Yule dinner around, if you will, the spiritual as well as the dinner. I have a favorite recipe for ham, which is actually an English traditional Yule ham recipe. It involves, getting a real ham, the kind what you have to soak for 2 days to get the salt out of it before you cook it, and cooking it up in cider with various herbs, spices. A small bundle of fresh straw is actually in the recipe. I mean, it's a very traditional recipe, but here you have the ham, the holy swine, and it's in the cider from the apples, and I could probably talk for 5 hours on the symbolism of apples to our ancestors. And then I might very well cook up a dish of leeks in butter, and again, leeks are one of those plants that, I could literally probably talk for hours because there is so much material about them. The dessert, traditional what they called soul cakes in England with the hazelnuts in them, and so on and so forth. Breads shaped like boars, breads shaped like swirly sun wheels were also real traditional in Scandinavia. Breads shaped like all sorts of things. Cheeses, in Sweden, when you were setting up the table, you would make what they would call cheese house. The mound word, the word for a burial cairn, but it was made out of cheese. And it was important to have great big ones of these sitting out on the table, to ensure, prosperity and fruitfulness in the year to come. This was, of course, tied in with the other very traditional activity of when you went to bed at night, on the Yule nights when your family was gathered together, you made a point of making beds and getting them all ready for the family members that were no longer actually walking around in bodies on the Middle Earth, because they're coming to dinner too. It's Yule. And Yule is when the whole family gets together, and our ancestors really meant the whole family, including the dead ones, and in fact the godly ones, because that's the other part of it. There is this sense in the Norse, this understanding that we're all, some of us can literally trace our ancestors back to the gods, or at least whoever wrote down royal pedigrees and was getting paid by the then crown, or in some cases composing royal pedigrees prior to the days when most of them were written down. But there is this fundamental understanding that the gods aren't, just these great, powerful beings that we worship. They're family, they're friends, and they're come to visit us, particularly at Yule. And you'd want to be ready. You'd want to have the places set. You'd certainly, if you see anyone ragged and hungry wandering by, you'd certainly want to give them a good feed and a drink, just, in case.
So the good King Wenceslas thing is not just a Christian idea.
No, it's definitely not. It would be a very shameful thing for a hall to turn aside a wanderer on a cold night, especially during the Yule nights. Not to mention that it would be massively asking for trouble.
Right. So when we get past Yule going to New Year's, is there anything else that seems to echo, at least, that people can bring in?
Yeah, New Year's, again, it's part of the overall. There's a couple of really interesting customs here in these islands, some of which may be Celtic, some of which are either probably Germanic or overlapping enough that it makes no difference. And one of them, and this one I believe is particularly an English thing, is wassailing the apple trees. If you have apple trees or fruit trees on your land, then what you want to do at New Year's is you want to get your horn of cider, or cup or bottle, whatever you drink your cider out of, and ideally your shotgun, and you go out into the apple orchard and you wassail the tree, you drink to it, you splash cider on it, you pour cider around its roots, and then you fire off your shotgun a few times through the branches to, drive off any ill-willing trolls or whatever might be lurking around. Obviously, the shotgun part couldn't have come in before people had shotguns, but I should be very surprised if previously it hadn't been, arrows or just throwing things, making noises.
So you could bring noisemakers out even today.
Yeah, if you are unfortunate enough not to have a shotgun, then you could bring out various noisemakers.
Or live somewhere where maybe shooting it off is not that good an idea, at least at your apple tree in your small suburban house.
Exactly.
With your neighbors.
Get a cat pistol. Just be careful there's no policeman watching.
Exactly. Well, that's, so then we would kind of, wrap up at the 17th, you say? Or?
Yeah, the very, very tail end of the season is Knut's Day, at least in Norway. It's January 17th. And as I said, that's when you serve the eviction notice on any trolls that came for the holidays and haven't gone home, wife's second cousin, whatever.
Yeah. And anything that would be done, I'd say between New Year's and the 17th in modern times would just kind of be personal family traditions.
Yeah,
if you have any.
Part of the reason why I think if you took a poll of Alsatru people, Germanic heathens today, you would find that the vast majority are choose that window between the solstice and New Year's, and part of that is because, well, it's kind of when we're used to all the stuff, and kind of goes along with everyone's schedule at the time. Not least and very definitely not least is the fact that that's when most of us get vacation.
Children are out of school, people can do things.
And of course, if one has the kind of job that makes one work on these nights, then there is always the happy alternative of shifting it to a bit later or earlier.
Exactly. I think that's one of the nice things. We have a bit more flexibility.
Yeah.
Then because it's not specifically fixed dates. Well, this has been really interesting. I can't believe it's been about an hour, but it has. And you did get a little spooky stuff in, so we have a little bit, and perhaps we'll do a bit more in January when it's dark. And I don't know if we have a topic. Either that or we might do Heathen Ritual Part 2. I'm not sure yet, because we still haven't. We've done, again, we touched a little bit on that tonight, but I want to get the second show in where we actually talk about more of how to perform a ritual. But you've got enough now that even if all you've heard of these broadcasts, I think, is to put together a reasonable Yule for your family and have a good time. So yes. I'd like to, you got anything else you'd like to say?
Have to say it. Glad Yule to all, and to all a good night.
Well, that's fantastic. We'll see you all next week with Cat's Eye on the Future. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.